I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Jeff Tench, President North America at Vantage Data Centers. Jeff, great to see you. Thanks for jumping on with us.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
This is an exciting time for Vantage. Like, I still remember when, probably 5 years ago when Vantage was like 2 or 3 markets in the US, and that has changed significantly, not just in the US, but also globally. And you have come into this role, over the last year or two. And I would just love, before we jump into some of the data center industry discussions that we'll talk about, love to hear about your background. I know you spent some time in the telecom space, and would just love to hear about how what you've done in the past has set you up to really lead the North America vision and operations for Vantage in the future.
Thanks, David. So yeah, I did start in telecom. My first job was at the regional Bell operating company, US West, where I started inauspiciously as a member of the customer service team in the residential call center. So there was that's where it all began.
Yeah, sure.
But spent a number of years there and moved into a product management career path, and then transitioned over to level 3 communications, where I spent the better part of 12 years. That has been a great background for what we're doing now in terms of just a long history in building digital infrastructure, going back to the mid 90s. And I spent the better part of 17 years doing that. We had data centers at the time. They weren't quite the things that we're building these days. It was more of a telecom colo style approach. But since then, where I left the telecom industry back in 2010, I've done a couple of different startups, including more recently a cloud consulting business. And so, what's interesting there is, our business was really spent helping enterprise customers take advantage of cloud platforms that have emerged over the course of the last several years. So entering Vantage, I've had the ability to look at both the sort of the development side of things and capital intensive projects on the one hand, but also, I've gotten some great experience understanding how our customers use the things that we're building on their behalf. So it's a nice way to sort of bookend, the entirety of what we're doing here in terms of building out digital infrastructure, both for now and into the future.
Yeah, and that's such a valuable, perspective to have. I think, certainly as you're leading what you're doing now, to know what those customer needs are, because you've obviously worked with them and helped take them from point A to point B in that cloud journey. That's certainly one of the trends, cloud adoption, cloud growth that has been impacting the data center space, not just this year, but for a while. One of the other things that we've seen has been just 2021 was a massive growth year in the midst of coming out of or maybe the pandemic, changing to what it is today. Like the vacancy rates that we track in North America, really gone from 12.2% on average to 9.2%. So a lot of demand. Just your background, you mentioned coming out of the telecom world, like we see connectivity being such an important part of the decision-making process with end users today. What are some of the trends that, you are at the tip of the spear for your organization? What are some of the trends you see impacting, our industry today, and how you're thinking about building and what markets you want to be in?
Well, we see if I go back over the course of a couple of years, and I think about the impact of COVID that it has had on the way in which the end user is leveraging cloud technologies. As I was exiting the consulting business that I'd created, we were seeing that immediately in terms of surge in demand and scarcity of capacity in some of the cloud provider environments. I think that era that we're hopefully now and that we're now exiting has demonstrated that the amount of tech intensity at the end user level, both in the commercial world and on the consumer world, has driven a resurgent demand for the companies that Vantage serves, the hyperscalers themselves. And so I think that while we're not yet past the peak in terms of workloads moving from owned and operated data centers by the enterprise into these cloud infrastructure, there's a lot more to do there. And the growth that we're seeing and the demand we're seeing from our customers is driven by, in many respects, the success that they've had with their own commercial cloud offerings. So that if that business for them is growing at 40% or more on a really large base, that means their capacity requirements are doubling every couple of years.
Yeah.
Now, there's some efficiency that'll be gained through Moore's law and less power intensity for the servers that they're putting into these facilities, but it does mean ultimately that they have to build every couple of years as much capacity from a data center perspective as they've ever built up to that point before. And that, as that starts to double on a much more larger base, the trend is that folks are looking for ways to do that more quickly. And I think leveraging partners like Vantage to help them get there.
Yeah, that's the idea at how the data is growing is really even hard to get, your mind around, just because of, I think conceptually it makes sense, like the way that we're as a society utilizing data, but just the growth, it's massive. And so just very quickly going back, you did your cloud consulting business, as you were working with enterprises that were trying to figure out how to utilize cloud. What was like the one or two things you felt like groups struggled with, or what was the challenge getting them from, maybe their previous way of thinking to that cloud adoption? And obviously, I think it's really important for people to understand that cloud adoption is like what is growing the data center, industry. So a lot of people, I think, oh, cloud is going to, diminish the data center industry's growth. It's the exact opposite, at least from what we track at Data Center Hawk. And I know obviously what Vantage is doing as well. But from your standpoint, what do companies, enterprises struggle with as they're trying to move towards that adoption?
Well, I think part of it is them re-examining from their perspective what they need to be great at to compete and win in their chosen markets. And for enterprises, being in the data center business themselves, I think they've reached that conclusion, right? So they don't need to be in the data center business themselves. And the question is, what form does that next take? There's opportunities for those folks to move from an owned and operated data center that they have to a more traditional retail colocation environment where it's still their kit, it's their servers, it's their applications, they're in control of it. And then there's a further shift towards public cloud through IaaS and PaaS type solutions. I think for many of them, the first step is getting out of the basement, as it were. And then from there, the question is, what is our cloud strategy? And for most of them, I think it's evolving into a hybrid strategy. For certain workloads, they want to keep close and in a more controlled environment. And for others, and some companies have gone all the way, right, where they've said everything's going to live in a public cloud environment. But that doesn't begin and end with infrastructure as a service or IaaS. I think increasingly, as the hyperscalers have further developed their platform as a service offerings, it's making a better argument to move more of workloads fully out into a public cloud environment. But both of those trends are happening. And for each enterprise, sometimes depending upon industry and sometimes depending upon their specific culture, they'll make choices that are right for them in terms of the mix, between, let's call it private and public cloud, but cloud it is. And I think for the vast majority of companies, they've decided that they don't need to be themselves in the data center business. And I think that's driving both growth in the retail and on the wholesale side, where of course, Vantage lives.
Sure. And when you think about the hyperscale sector, there's a number of companies obviously that make up that group, but how long do you think we'll be in this time period of growth for them? I mean, we've been, the last few years have marked a very strong growth period. How long does that last in the, time period that we're in?
If I knew the exact answer to that, I'd be more valuable to my company than maybe I am today. But it's somewhat difficult to predict. So what can we look at, right, that helps us understand that? I think there's a couple of trends. One is, to the extent that growth in the data center business in general, both retail and wholesale, is driven by application and workload migration to these colocation environments as opposed to owned and operated. How far along in that journey are we? What percentage of those workloads have moved? I mean, the estimates vary, but I think it's still probably less than 50%. And so there's still a long way to go there in terms of that overall cloud migration, where you're just getting a workload to live in a different place. I think the other factor, though, relates to just overall tech intensity, the amount of capability that exists within these cloud platforms that enterprises are increasingly leveraging. gives them a different lens in which to look through how they want to build applications going forward. What can they automate and throw code at that previously they would throw people at? So I think it's another factor that multiplies the effect. And that doesn't even get into the amount of data that's yet to be created as the edge of the world becomes smarter, right? Where things become more connected. That's going to throw enormous amounts of data into the ecosystem that needs to live somewhere. It needs to be managed. It needs to be manipulated. It needs to have algorithms driven against it. So I'm very bullish in terms of where this is headed. I think that we're on a trend here that will continue for some time.
Yeah, that seems to be the general consensus among our industry leaders. I think is that to your point is that we are going to be in this time for a while. From a more of a real estate perspective, where these workloads exist from a geography perspective does matter to certain organizations based off the type of applications that they're trying to serve and customer experience they're trying to create. One of the trends we have seen with a data center hawk has been, if you think about a data center market, the development that's taking place in different submarkets within that market. A good example is Phoenix, and you all have a project there, and it's a great time to maybe highlight that. But Phoenix has grown. In 2017 was 245 megawatts of multi-tenant data center power. 2019 was 294 megawatts. Now, at the end of 2021, 372 megawatts, and the market's only getting larger. And it highlights the demand. But what that has done, it's really pushed data center development into different parts of the market. So just talk about that. I mean, you all are right in the middle of that. It affects your decision making, your capital allocation, where you spend your money. Talk about why that's happening and how that impacts customers.
Well, I think there's a few different factors there. I mean, for certain use cases, for our customers, their use cases, latency is critically important. So placing their capability, their compute and storage capability as close to the eyeball community that they're serving is critical. That tends to take the form more in terms of edge deployments. When you're looking at any particular market, what many customers, what the hyperscaler customers will do is they'll try to create a series of what they will generically call availability zones, which allows multiple deployments or clusters of data centers to be in very close proximity with one another, but not too close, right? So there's a blast radius consideration that they have to have, but they can't be so far away that they don't have effectively real-time capability for synchronization, mainly around database redundancy and resiliency, so that if one node within that cluster fails, everything falls over to the other, and it's virtually instantaneous. Mm-hmm. So the creation of these submarkets means that once you've established a point of presence there, you're going to build around that until you can at least have 3, sometimes 4 different availability zones in a cluster. And in a case like Phoenix, you see that happening in submarkets like Chandler or Central Phoenix. Maybe Chandler creeps up and grabs a little bit of Mesa or Tempe along the way. But of course, then there's a separate submarket out to the west where our facility and our project is underway. In Goodyear, where there's again, a center there. Mm-hmm. The distance between, Phoenix is a pretty big market geographically, right? The distance between Goodyear and Chandler is 50 plus miles.
Long way, yeah.
It's so far away, it might as well be a separate market, though it's generally considered part of the Phoenix metro area. So I think there's a concentration that you have because they have to build an architecture that allows for resiliency and redundancy. And then in some respects, it's inertial, right? Once they deploy, they have to, our customers and ourselves for that matter, have to deploy people to run and operate these data centers. And then our customers are coming in and doing what they've got to do within our data halls. So once you've established a presence, there's a center of gravity that may be created in a given market. And the selection of one versus another in many respects is just down to the idiosyncrasies of a particular customer and what they've chosen to do. And what can we then do to help them, maintain their growth trajectory?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's really interesting, if you look at a map, at least some of the mapping we've done, just watching the growth, you mentioned kind of around the center point of a market or the center point of a submarket. And once it gets established, the continual investment that goes in, not just from you've got the facilities and all the power and connectivity, but just the company's internal networks, to continue to build those applications and the increased latency decrease latency is really valuable for those companies. One of the questions we get a lot is, hey, when do you think this like bubble is going to burst? Are there risk factors, that are coming in? Kind of going back to what you were saying around the time period that we're in. But I mean, from your standpoint, do you think there's potential that we, a year from now just go, where did all the demand go? I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
I was over my career trying to do as best we can to protect the downside, and
Sure.
hopefully the upside takes care of itself, right?
Sure.
So, there's certainly Vantage and others in the industry right now are enjoying an enormous amount of tailwind right now, but there are headwinds out there, right? So there is a surge in demand that I think all of us are seeing over the course of the last 12 months or so. That is coming, by the way, with some trends with regard to pricing, as supply and demand is a bit out of whack. So we're definitely seeing a trend towards increased pricing, which is driven by not just a shortage of supply of what we're doing, but also cost inputs, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
There's and those cost inputs range, right, from OFCI costs to just raw materials around steel and concrete. Labor is under pressure across the board. So there's a number of factors that influence that. Now, are prices increasing to the point where it will stifle demand? A little hard to tell. I'm not sure anyone's done the elasticity equation on some of this stuff. But, I think the part of the question we're asking is this surge that we're seeing at the moment, and certainly it's a change in the trajectory. The surge there's been an increase in demand, obviously, for several years, but it's really ramped up in the last 12 months. What is that being driven by? Is it being driven by purely an increase in overall demand? Is it driven by a shift from the hyperscaler community towards inviting partners into the mix as they seek to satisfy their capacity requirements? And or is it forward buying? Is it looking forward and saying, I want to make sure that one of my customers is looking forward and saying, I want to be able to secure capacity with certainty over the course of the next 2 to 3 years? And is there going to be a drop off of that as they're digesting that absorption, as you will? I'm not sure we know the answers to those questions, but I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that there might be a bit of a hump here. But I think the longer term trends persist. I think the fundamentals behind the secular trend that we're riding are much longer term than that. And while there may be a little bit of variation in the rate of growth, I think that growth is still the word of the day here for the next several years.
Yeah, and the where we are in the industry just highlights how young this data center space really is, and the growth that we've seen in the market. The only thing I can point back to from a data perspective, if you look at 2018 and 2019, we saw a lot of growth from like cloud service providers as well as some other larger users. And then in 2019, there was a bit of a digestion period, as you mentioned. And then, you have 2020, 2021, 2022. So we're starting to see this next wave, I would say. And one of the things, if like I look at the 2020 and 2021 growth, especially in areas like Northern Virginia, we actually saw some international data center users actually coming into the US market. Most of the time, the trend has been large US companies going out to, other international markets in Europe or APAC or things like that. But we saw some of those companies come here. What do you think that will be like in the next few years as it relates to international companies coming to North America, and setting up their footprints here?
I think it's a question of what does the topology, the data center topology or the network topology look like for any company that is starting to experience growth and questions about how they scale. For some of our customers, they've begun their journey with a new service. They're entering the market. And the first requirement is ubiquity. They've got to be able to serve their customer base because they have a global strategy from nearly any location. Building and operating, data centers around the world that are capable of supporting, dozens of megawatts each time is not a great way to start. So what do? They'll start with, deploying very small deployments with a retail colocation provider that has an enormous amount of reach, or they'll partner with a cloud service provider, a hyperscaler, and rent, if you will, or lease capacity. As they grow, the question becomes, how does my supply chain, how does the degree of vertical integration I have change over time, where I can now justify larger scale commitments in fewer places. Another factor is over time, if they're happy to serve their customer base from one location, but as they grow, they need to deploy more, or let's just say closer to the edge over time. And I think that's the trend that you're seeing, where European customers who have a US base, European customers of mine who have US bases of customers of theirs, as they grow, they can now justify the economic decision associated with deploying and committing to either built or leased capacity closer to where that customer base is. So as a result, it has the impact of further depleting available capacity, and it adds to the mix in terms of saying, well, it's not 5 hyperscalers that are competing, it's now 10. It's starting to look like hyperscalers, and I think that further impacts the sort of supply demand equations, the search for available land, and all the other things that go with that.
Yeah, I think the growth of like that mid-tier, we have some users in our space that are doing enormous things, and then there's a group right below that historically has been very active, but the size has been smaller. And those sizes are starting to creep up. They are starting to do things almost more like some of these bigger users. And to your point, that's really putting a strain on, some of the planning that was done around, hey, we have this site for the next 3 years that will accommodate, 144 megawatts. And, within 3 months of getting the site and starting the planning, like it's pre-leased. And that's maybe that's a great problem to have for organizations like yours, which is, hey,
I prefer that problem over the opposite, right?
Sure.
Where I'm back on, and I've got to carry, or I'm just in perennial banking mode.
Yeah, I understand. Yes, totally. So, okay. So I mentioned at the beginning, Vantage historically had their operations in the US, and then over the last several years has just exploded from a growth perspective and an acquisition standpoint. So now a global provider across multiple continents, what are some of the things you're learning maybe from having operations in other parts of the world that, is helping you in North America, maybe tune your strategy to accommodating the future growth of the industry?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. It was only a few years ago that Vantage was operating basically in Santa Clara, and it started to expand with a small deployment in Quincy, and of course the business has grown across the U.S. and up into Canada, and then we leapt across the pond through a couple of acquisitions to get started. We now have a business across Europe and in a lot of different markets, and then even more recently in APAC. So, the amount of growth we've had to deal with and accommodate has been absolutely extraordinary. One of the reasons I'm here, right, is to change our organization to create a structure that allows us to run these businesses with more of a regional focus. But to your question, we learn a lot. We learn a lot, and it goes in both directions, right? At the same time that having a standard in terms of how we do things around here, what types of buildings are we building, having commonality of design that can be deployed in nearly any geography with the appropriate adaptations based on site geometry or local jurisdiction has proven to be really effective for us. For having a clear view in mind in terms of our design, what makes it more efficient, how does that allow us to build both quickly and cheaply and satisfy the very, very hard to satisfy requirements of our very demanding customers, but at the same time recognizing that this business is incredibly local. In so many ways. I mean, you're involved in building a very large building that consumes a lot of power in a very specific place. And that has impact on your employees. It has impact on your partners, your vendors, your general contractors, and the trades that work there. And we take that responsibility very seriously. So what we learn about what works in a given geography, we have centers of excellence across our business where we share that information and ensure that we recirculate it so we can apply it in a new location, whether it be a particular technology or approach towards design around cooling or around power generation for redundancy, et cetera. Moving into a global footprint has proven to be incredibly useful at picking up ideas that work in a particular geo that maybe we hadn't thought of in another one, but now we can see it, we see that it worked, we can apply it, and we can get even better in different parts of the world because of something that happened 5,000 miles away.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point. It's like the data center operators that understand the ability to grow globally, but be at the local level too, and do things really well there, are certainly the ones that will make a lot of progress and win. You have to be focused at that local level because of things you brought up. It's just massive amounts of infrastructure designed to, support these buildings. And there's less and less even just land now to support in some of these markets historically that have had plenty of growth. I think about obviously Northern Virginia. If you can find a site in Santa Clara to build more data center space, you're winning, because that's a very hard thing to do. Vantage has figured out how to do that over time. So your ability to operate well on a local level is really important. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the crystal ball question here as we kind of wrap up. But when you think about the industry moving forward, where are we going to be in 3 to 5 years from now? Like what will the industry look like? What do you think the supply and demand will look like? What will it be like then?
Well, look, I mean, our business tends to be built on a smaller number of very large customers, right? Which allows us to be incredibly focused in understanding their requirements and where they're heading. I think one thing that is on our minds and on everyone else's mind is how can we as an industry be more sustainable in our approach. So I think that there's been some recent announcements about the use of alternative fuels in generators. Vantage is leaning in on that topic as well. So I think there's definitely going to be a continued push towards doing real things to reduce carbon footprint across the industry, driven both by our own sense of responsibility to the communities in which we operate, to the world in general, but also those driven by our largest customers who have strong agendas in this regard. We do consume a lot of power. We want to be able to do that responsibly and efficiently. So I think that trend will continue, and you're going to see more and more, green type initiatives. And I don't mean greenwashing. I mean like
Sure.
Real investment, real commitment that's being made to reduce the impact that we're having. I think that density is also going to be on the rise. I think we're going to start to see, different types of cooling technologies that are going to be deployed within the data center community. Right now, everybody's kind of using a combination of the same things with some variation based on the nature of the climate and wherever that data center happens to live. I think there'll be a trend more towards liquid cooling as data center, as the density of a particular rack or whatever form the servers take in terms of where they live starts to increase. So I think that is something that we've leaned forward on as well, and have spent a lot of energy ensuring that all of our data centers are prepared for a liquid-based cooling approach. As those densities increase, it can't just continue on a linear basis. Those are a couple of trends in terms of the technology and the approach. I think what is also true is that the underlying drivers of the demand for this will continue as well. I think the scale that we're seeing right now in terms of what is being built and where it's being built will continue on its current trajectory to the point where things that are thin at the edge become thick. The edge itself moves further out. And I think that, as we think about having smaller data centers closer to the edge of the network, those become bigger. And I think we all need to be planful in terms of what that then implies and the impacts that it has on our communities, but also in terms of how do we get ahead of that curve. So I'm again quite bullish in terms of where things are headed, but there are going to be some influences here that force, I think, in a good way, for the entire industry to think more deliberately about where they're heading, 3, 4, 5 years from now. But I do expect a lot more of the same. The question will be, what are the use cases that we're all collectively enabling for, ourselves and our personal lives? That we've got so much more to go there, so much more data that's yet to be generated. It's going to be a challenge, certainly, in terms of figuring out the right paths to keep the stakeholder groups that we all operate within, happy about what we're doing. Because I think it's a net good for what we're doing out there, but there's a lot of challenges along the way.
Yeah, and I think with the challenges that you mentioned, there's just so much opportunity in this industry for people to join. I'm consistently reminded of the leadership in our space and the steps organizations and leaders are taking to make sure that this industry in the next, year, 3, 5, 10, and 50 is doing its best to serve the world in a way that it matches the needs of customers, but does so in a sustainable fashion. To make sure that the world's resources are used, as efficiently as possible. So, Jeff, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. Your perspective is really helpful on our space. I know you can find Jeff on LinkedIn. You can also find Vantage Data Centers, all their locations in North America. It's not just North America or Northern Virginia or Phoenix that we talked about. It's certainly Northern California, the Pacific Northwest. You'll have operations in Canada.
Yeah.
So we know y'all are busy here in North America as well as other locations, but thank you so much for the time, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Really enjoyed it, David. Thanks for having me on.